Hey, food science. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about conditions that make bacteria grow really well. We've spent a lot of time talking about disease outbreaks and contact tracing and all that kind of stuff. And we talked about bacteria as being one of the primary culprits of things that ends up killing people when we get foodborne illness. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking a little bit about conditions that bacteria like to grow in, and then we're going to do a lab coming up where we're going to take a look at some different types of food and washing them and what that ends up looking like with the bacteria that grow on them. So when we talk about bacteria growing, bacteria are unicellular, which means that they have one cell. They're a one-celled organism. And what ends up happening is that when bacteria grow big enough, what happens is they kind of stretch and expand. And when they get to a point that they are large enough, they actually go through a process called binary division, which means that they split into two parts. And this only happens when conditions are kind of in the perfect circumstances and they split. You can see here kind of in the image that this is two bacteria at this point that are going to be splitting from the one. And so they keep splitting and growing like that. So 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, and so on and so forth. Okay, what I have here is a little video that actually does a really good job of showing how it grows.
Bacteria reproduce very simply and rapidly by doubling their contents and splitting in two. Just one bacterium, dividing every 20 minutes, could produce nearly 5,000 billion bacteria in one day.
So you can see in the video here that we start off with just a few of those bacteria. And then what ends up happening is that they split, and then those split, and they split, and they split, and again, and again, and again. And so when you have one bacteria, it doesn't seem like a lot. But if the conditions are right, that bacteria can multiply and grow in what ends up being a really short period of time. So you see that kind of splitting that happens, and then it ends up kind of growing out of control pretty quickly. So that's why when you get infected with something, if your body doesn't take care of it and kill it right away, you could end up getting sick because those bacteria can really multiply really quickly. When we talk about bacteria, bacteria growth goes in a very predictable phase. So the very first part of the curve that you're kind of seeing here, this low part, is called the lag phase. And in the video where you saw it start, there were a few bacteria that were splitting and it didn't look like that much was happening. And it's called the lag phase because not that much is going on and the growth seems to be lagging. But what ends up happening is that once you get what they call a critical mass of bacteria, that growth picks up really, really quickly. And what we call that growth period is the exponential growth period. So what ends up happening is that there's just a ton of food for the bacteria to eat, the conditions are great, and everything is happy and just keeps growing and splitting. And so you end up getting that exponential growth that we talk about. You've probably heard it with COVID and all that kind of stuff. It is rapid. And that's where in the video you saw all those bacteria. What tends to happen then is you will hit a point which they call the stationary phase. And what happens is as some of the bacteria grow and multiply, others of them are dying. So if you think about this graph as the number of bacteria versus the time, things start off very slow, then they pick up like crazy, and then they kind of level off. So what ends up happening is some of the bacteria kind of run out of food while others are growing, and they go into what we call an equilibrium. And an equilibrium is where we have about the same number of bacteria splitting as well as dying, so the numbers stay relatively constant. And that will continue on as long as there is enough food and the conditions are correct. Things that can slow it down is what we'll get into in a little bit to talk about like what you need for that. But then what ends up happening is eventually the party just ends. We run out of food, and then you hit what's called the death phase there. So what ends up happening is as we run out of food, you don't have enough food to support the bacteria, and then eventually they start to die. And so it goes through that process again. Now, some bacteria actually can like put themselves in spores or things like that. And then they put themselves into what they call a long-term stationary phase until they end up finding something new to infect. And so they kind of all go through that process. But as long as a bacteria has the right conditions, and food, it's going to kind of keep growing and growing. And then eventually, like if this is in your body, if you get too many of them, you potentially can get sick. Now, there are some things that affect bacterial growth, and we're going to talk about these, and they're going to be really important for the next units coming up. The first one is temperature. So bacteria, for the most part, love things kind of warm and cozy. So they are not really going to grow particularly well when it's below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. There are some bacteria that can do that, but in general, they don't grow really well. Their best temperature range is between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. In foods, we call this the danger zone, and that's the temperature where you don't want to keep food, because food tends to be a good place for bacteria to grow when it's that temperature. So refrigerators keep their temperatures underneath 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and freezers are below freezing. Okay. When you put bacteria into colder conditions, they split and duplicate slower than they would if it were warm. So putting something into a freezer does not kill the bacteria. When you thaw out that food, the bacteria will be present, and it will start to split and multiply again. So that is not going to kill it. So you can't be like, oh, I'm going to throw this into the freezer and I'm going to kill the bacteria. That's not going to work. What will happen is that you can put it in there to slow the bacteria down, but it's not going to stop them. The only thing that does stop bacteria as far as temperature goes is a high heat. So if you hit a certain temperature, and it's different for each type of bacteria, then if you hit that temperature for a certain length of time, then you should be pretty good to go as far as killing those bacteria. Okay. Another thing is oxygen availability. Some bacteria that are what we call aerobic need oxygen to grow. So if you cut the oxygen supply off of those things, then they are not going to grow. Other types of bacteria that don't need oxygen are called anaerobic, and they don't need oxygen to survive. Those can be especially dangerous in canned goods, because in canned goods, you seal it off and you don't have any oxygen in there. But if you have an anaerobic bacteria in there, you could potentially still have it growing in there. This is a really big problem for things like when you're a home canner, or if you can buy canned goods. If you buy a canned good at the grocery store and you see a bulgy top, so it's not flat, it's like poked out and is bulgy, you probably do not want to buy that, because there is a chance that the bacteria that is in there is growing and multiplying and producing gas that's causing that to bulge, and that's not good. A dented can usually means some kid dropped it, but in general, bulged cans aren't good. It's also really important that when you cook things to the right temperature, and then we'll talk about acid, but the acid is right, because otherwise those bacteria can be there as well. Okay. Another condition that affects how your bacteria grow is what we call the water activity. So the water activity is how much water is available for microbes, which are bacteria, to use. And generally, bacteria like it damp, or you'll hear the word moist as well. I know people don't like that word, but they like it damp. So they're going to need a more wet condition to grow. And that's why when you go grocery shopping, you'll notice that all of the stuff that's in the freezer and cooler sections in general is stuff that's damp. And that's because they need to be cooled down so that the bacteria don't grow and multiply in them, because we want to slow them down, because they're kind of wet and they have what we call a high water activity. Dry conditions are harder to grow in. So all of your boxed goods, your pastas, that kind of stuff that sit in the middle of your grocery store, those things have very low amounts of water for bacteria. And so they have really long shelf lives. Like beef jerky, if you think about it, is all dried out. So the bacteria can't multiply on there. Ooh, I'm going to go back. One thing I forgot. Another thing that can also affect this that has kind of to do with dryness is salt. If you make conditions very salty, bacteria don't do well in that. Bacteria are actually kind of, the water is pulled out of bacteria if they're in very salty conditions. And so they tend to last longer as well. It's why like ham lasts a little bit longer in your refrigerator compared to chicken or turkey or something like that. And again, it's one of the reasons why beef jerky lasts a really long time. It's dry and it's really salty. Okay. The last one that we're going to talk about is acidity, or the amount of acid that is in something. So you don't think probably that you are consuming lots of acids, but most of the food that you eat is actually acidic. So what ends up happening is that if you want to have something that has a long shelf life, you are going to need to have it have a lot of acid in it to kill those bad bacteria. What that means is it either has a low pH or a high acid content. So what I mean by that is if you guys go to the store and you buy let's say a can of tomatoes, those tomatoes have to be cooked in either one of two ways. They need to either have the right amount of acid that's added in there, or they need to be cooked at the right temperature, because otherwise they could go bad. Things that have lots of acid in them as far as beverages go would be like orange juice, soda, things like that that tend to last a long time. Those are generally going to have a longer shelf life than things like milk or things like apple juice, which don't have as much acid, because they have less ability to kind of kill the bacteria or hold the bacteria back. So what ends up happening is, like, when you can a food or something like that, the acid level needs to be correct. Otherwise, your canned good can grow bacteria. So you got to keep that acid level high enough at a low pH to make that happen. Okay, so those are the different factors that affect bacterial growth. We're going to be taking a look at those kinds of things, as well as how to safely handle food and all that kind of stuff as we go along. If you have any questions, pop into a Google Meet and we'll get things cleared up. Thanks.